There are moments in life when everything you thought you left behind comes knocking at your door, demanding one more chance at redemption. For a lonely mountain man living in the remote highlands, that moment came during the worst storm the frontier had ever seen. A desperate widow appeared at his cabin, soaked and trembling, begging him to help find her two little daughters who had vanished into the dark wilderness. The townspeople refused to search in such deadly weather, but this man couldn't turn away. What he didn't know was why those girls had run into the storm in the first place, or what secrets this widow was hiding that would change everything he thought he understood about courage and family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Mercer had lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, and in that time he'd grown comfortable with the silence. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing where the pines grew so tall they seemed to hold up the sky itself. It was a good spot, high enough to see weather coming from miles away, close enough to a spring for fresh water, and far enough from Timber Falls that nobody bothered him unless they had good reason. He was 52 years old, though the lines on his face might have suggested older. The mountain, sun and wind had weathered his skin like old leather, and his beard had gone more grey than brown. But his hands were still steady, his eyes still sharp, and his body still carried the strength of a man who split his own wood and hauled his own water every day of the year. The cabin itself reflected the man who lived there, simple, solid, built to last. One main room with a stone fireplace that Jacob had laid himself, a smaller bedroom in the back, and a loft where he stored his supplies. The furniture was sparse but well made. A table he'd built from pine, 2 chairs though he only needed one, a rope bed with a thick mattress stuffed with pine needles and dried grass. Everything had its place, and everything served a purpose. Above the fireplace hung his Henry repeating rifle, the same one he'd carried during his years as an army scout. He kept it cleaned and oiled, though he rarely took it down except for hunting. It represented a part of his life he'd thought was finished, the violence, the tracking, the constant movement. Now he preferred the predictable rhythms of mountain life. Rising with the sun, tending his small garden in summer, checking his trapline in winter, and spending his evenings carving small figures from pine wood that he'd occasionally trade in town for supplies. Jacob hadn't always been alone. The worn gold band he still wore on his left hand testified to that. Her name had been Margaret, and she'd been the kind of woman who could make a one-room cabin feel like a palace just by being in it. Their son Daniel he's been 6 years old, bright-eyed and curious about everything, always asking questions that made Jacob think harder about the world. They died 8 years ago, almost to the day. A sudden storm, not unlike the one gathering now, had caught them near Dead Man's Ridge while Jacob was away on a scouting job. He'd needed the money, had promised it would be his last trip. Margaret had understood, she always did, and had taken Daniel to visit her sister in the valley. They never made it. The flash flood had come out of nowhere, the kind that turns a dry creek bed into a raging torrent in minutes. Jacob had found them 3 days later. He didn't let himself think about those 3 days very often. After that, he'd quit scouting, sold their house in Timber Falls, and built this cabin as far from other people as he could manage, while still being able to trade for necessities. The townspeople understood, mostly. They left him alone, except for the occasional request to track a lost cow or guide a surveying party through the high country. He obliged when the pay was fair, but he never stayed in town longer than necessary. His relationship with Timber Falls was cordial, but distant. The shopkeepers knew him, the blacksmith respected his business, and the minister had stopped trying to get him to come to Sunday services after the first year. Jacob wasn't angry at God, he just figured they had an understanding now. God did his work, and Jacob did his, and they didn't need to make a fuss about it. The days followed a comfortable pattern. Wake before dawn, start the fire, make coffee strong enough to strip paint, tend to his horse, a sturdy grey mare named Silver, who'd been with him for 6 years. Check the perimeter of his property for animal signs. Work on whatever project needed, doing repairs to the cabin, cutting firewood, tanning a hide, fixing his tools. Simple supper, usually whatever game he'd caught or smoked venison from his stores. Evening time for carving by lamplight, the quiet interrupted only by the pop and crackle of the fire. He'd made his peace with loneliness. That's what he told himself anyway. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was bearable. And bearable was more than he'd had in those first years, after Margaret and Daniel died, when every morning had been a battle just to find a reason to get out of bed. The storm had been building all day. Jacob had noticed it that morning, the particular quality of the light, the way the wind shifted from the northwest, carrying the smell of rain from far off. Animals knew it too. The birds had been busy all afternoon, and he'd seen a fox moving its kits to higher ground. By evening, the clouds had rolled in thick and dark, turning the sky the color of old bruises. Jacob had made his preparations with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd weathered many mountain storms. He'd brought in extra firewood and stacked it by the hearth, checked that his shutters were secure, brought Silver into the small lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north side with extra hay and water, filled his water buckets from the spring before the rain made the path treacherous, set his spare lanterns where he could find them if the power of the storm blew out his main light. He'd made himself supper beans and cornbread and was sitting by the fire with his carving knife and a piece of pine, working on a small horse that was gradually taking shape from the wood. The wind had begun to howl around the cabin's corners, and rain was drumming steadily on the roof. It would be a bad one, he could tell. The kind of storm that made you grateful for solid walls and a good fire. Jacob had no notion that his life was about to change. No premonition that the peace he'd so carefully constructed over 8 years was about to be shattered by a desperate knock on his door. He was thinking about whether he needed to ride into Timber Falls in the next few days for supplies, and whether the storm would make the trails impassable for a while. The carving was coming along nicely. He could see the horse clearly now in the wood, just needed to coax it out with careful cuts. Margaret had always loved watching him carve. She'd said he had patient hands, that he could see beauty hiding in ordinary things. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Thunder rumbled through the mountains, deep and resonant. The rain became a deluge, hammering the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Wind screamed through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, Jacob heard the crack of a tree giving way. He added another log to the fire and settled deeper into his chair. It was going to be a long night, but he was safe and warm. That was enough. He had no idea that less than a mile away, 2 little girls were huddled together in the dark and cold, terrified and lost. He didn't know that their mother was about to make a desperate ride through the worst storm the frontier had seen in a decade, gambling everything on the hope that a man she barely knew might have the courage to help her when everyone else had refused. Jacob Mercer thought he'd left the world behind. He thought his days of fighting for something, of mattering to someone, were over. He was wrong. The world was about to come crashing back into his life with the force of that storm, and nothing would ever be the same again. The pounding on the door came just after midnight, so forceful and desperate that Jacob was on his feet with his hand on his rifle before he was fully awake. The sound cut through the storm like a scream, insistent and frantic. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pausing at the door. "Who's there? Please." The voice was female, strained with panic and barely audible over the wind. "Please, I need help." "My daughters." Jacob threw the bolt and pulled the door open. A woman nearly fell across his threshold, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and her eyes were wild with terror. "They're gone," she gasped, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Emma and Lucy, they're out there in this. I can't find them. Get inside." Jacob pulled her in and shut the door against the wind that tried to rip it from his hands. Water pooled on his floor as she stood there, swaying slightly. He recognized her vaguely, Sarah Bennett, the widow who lived on the old Holloway place about 5 miles south. He'd seen her in town a few times but never spoken to her. "Sit down before you fall down." He guided her to the chair by the fire. "Start from the beginning." She was wearing a threadbare wool shawl over a simple dress, both soaked through. Jacob grabbed a blanket from his bed and draped it over her shoulders, then poured coffee from the pot he kept warm by the fire. She clutched the cup with both hands, and he noticed they were scratched and bleeding. "My daughters," she began, her voice steadier now but thick with desperation. "Emma is 7. Lucy just turned 5. They were in the cabin. I thought they were asleep, but when I checked on them around 9 o'clock, they were gone. Both of them. Just gone into this storm." "How long ago?" 3 hours, maybe 4. I searched everywhere around the homestead, called for them until my voice gave out. Then I rode into town." Her voice broke. "No one would help. They said it was too dangerous, that we'd have to wait until morning." Jacob's jaw tightened. He knew the men in Timber Falls, knew their general decency, but he also knew their limits. A storm like this, it was genuinely deadly. Flash floods in the ravines, trees coming down, visibility near zero. They weren't wrong to refuse. But children were out there. That changed everything. "Why would they run?" Jacob asked quietly. "Children don't just leave a warm cabin in a storm like this without reason." Sarah's face crumpled. "I don't know. I've been trying to understand. Emma has been quiet lately, protective of her sister. Something's been troubling her, but she wouldn't tell me what." She looked up at Jacob, her eyes pleading. "I know you don't know me, Mr. Mercer. I know you keep to yourself, but you were the only one I could think of who might actually—" "Where were they last seen?" Jacob was already moving, pulling on his heavy oilskin coat. "Near Widow's Creek, I think. I found—" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden doll, hand-carved and worn smooth. This was on the bank. Lucy's doll. She never goes anywhere without it. Jacob took the doll, turned it over in his hands. Widow's Creek was 2 miles north of Sarah's homestead, which meant the girls had been moving away from town, away from help, toward the high country where the terrain got rough and the dangers multiplied. "That creek will be running high," he said. "If they tried to cross, please don't say it." Sarah stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay you whatever you have. I'll sell the homestead. I don't want your money." Jacob was strapping on his gun belt now, checking that his knife was secure. He took down the Henry rifle, loaded it with practiced efficiency. "But I need you to think. Is there anywhere they might have been trying to get to? Any place they talked about?" Sarah shook her head helplessly. "They love the forest. Emma's always exploring, bringing Lucy along. But in weather like this it makes no sense. Unless they were running from something," Jacob thought. But there wasn't time to puzzle it out now. Every minute they stood here talking was another minute those children were out in the cold and dark. He gathered supplies, rope, extra lantern oil, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a flask of whiskey for warmth, strips of dried venison. His mind was already working through the terrain, calculating distances and dangers. Widow's Creek flowed north and east, following the natural valley between 2 ridges. If the girls had followed it, and children usually did follow water, they'd be heading toward the old mining trails. "I'm coming with you," Sarah said. "No, you're exhausted and—" "They're my daughters." Her voice was steel now. All the panic burned away into fierce determination. "I'm coming." Jacob looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe late 20s, pretty in a worn-down way, like someone who'd been carrying weight too heavy for too long, but there was strength in her face, in the set of her jaw. She wasn't asking permission. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then we're wasting time." He handed her his spare oilskin coat. "Put this on, and when we're out there, you do exactly what I say. When I say it, No arguments. Understood? Understood. They went out into the storm together. The wind hit them like a physical blow, and the rain was so heavy it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jacob led Silver out of the lean-to, and Sarah's horse, a bay mare that looked half dead from exhaustion, stood where she'd left it tied. "Your horse won't make it," Jacob said. "We'll both ride, Silver." "She's strong enough." He helped Sarah mount, then swung up behind her. She was shivering again despite the coat, and he could feel the tremors running through her body. He kicked Silver into motion, and they headed north toward Widow's Creek. The world was reduced to darkness, rain, and the narrow beam of the lantern Jacob held. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it felt like the sky splitting open. Water ran in streams down the trail, and twice Silver stumbled on the slick ground. But she kept going, sure-footed despite the conditions, responding to Jacob's steady guidance. "Tell me about them," Jacob said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "Your daughters." "Emma's the serious one," Sarah said, and he could hear the ache in her voice. "Always thinking, always watching. She takes care of Lucy, treats her like she's the mother sometimes. Lucy's the sweet one, laughs at everything, makes up songs. She has your doll everywhere she goes." Her voice caught. "She's so small, Mr. Mercer." "They're both so small." "They're tough," Jacob said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Any child brave enough to go out in this storm is tough. We'll find them." He didn't know if he believed it, but Sarah needed to hear it, and maybe saying it out loud made it a little more possible. They reached Widow's Creek after 30 minutes of hard riding. The creek had become a river, swollen and angry, rushing over its banks. Jacob dismounted and helped Sarah down, then moved along the bank with the lantern held high, searching for any sign. "There!" Sarah grabbed his arm, pointing. A piece of blue fabric was snagged on a low branch, a torn strip from what might have been a child's dress. Jacob examined it, then looked across the raging water. On the far bank, barely visible in the lantern light, he saw what he was looking for. Small footprints in the mud, already being washed away by the rain. "They crossed," he said. "Somehow, they made it across." "How?" Sarah's voice was anguished. "How could they? The water was lower when they came through. It's risen since." Jacob studied the creek, calculating. There was a spot about 20 yards upstream where the water ran shallower over a stretch of rocks. In daylight, without the storm, it would be an easy crossing. Now, it might kill them. "We have to try," Sarah said, reading his thoughts. Jacob looked at her, then at the raging water, then back at her. He thought of Daniel, of what he would have wanted someone to do if his son had been lost and afraid in a storm. He thought of Margaret, who had always believed that people were fundamentally good, that they would help each other when it mattered most. "Hold on to me," he said, "and don't let go no matter what happens." Jacob worked quickly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He tied one end of his rope around a sturdy pine tree, tested it twice, then secured the other end around his waist. The rock face was slick with rain and mud, but he'd climbed worse in his army days. "Hold the lantern steady," he told Sarah. "I need to see what I'm doing." He went over the edge backward, using the rope to control his descent. His boots scraped against wet stone, searching for purchase. The wind tried to push him sideways, and rain pelted his face, but he kept his focus on the small figure below. Lucy was curled into herself on the narrow ledge, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile. As Jacob descended closer, he could see she was shaking from cold, fear, or both. "Lucy," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "My name is Jacob. Your mama sent me to get you." The little girl looked up, and even in the dim light he could see her, tear-streaked face. "I want my mama. I know, sweetheart, and she wants you too. She's right up there waiting. But I need you to be very brave for just a little bit longer. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded, though her chin was trembling. Jacob reached the ledge and carefully positioned himself beside her. The space was even more precarious than it had looked from above, barely 2 feet wide, with crumbling edges. One wrong move, and they'd both go over. He uncoiled a second length of rope from his belt and fashioned a quick harness around Lucy's small body. His fingers were cold and stiff, but muscle memory guided them through the knots he'd tied 1,000 times before. "This might feel a little tight," he said, "but it's going to keep you safe. I'm going to carry you up, and this rope means even if I slip, you won't fall. Understand? Are you strong enough?" Lucy's question was so earnest, so childlike, despite their dire situation, that Jacob almost smiled. "I'm strong enough," he promised. He secured her against his chest with one arm, tested the ropes one more time, then began the climb. It was harder going up, much harder. Lucy's added weight threw off his balance, and the rock offered few good handholds. Twice his boot slipped, and only the rope kept them from falling. He could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath from above each time. But Jacob had survived worse than this. He'd carried wounded men through hostile territory, had climbed cliff faces under enemy fire, had pushed his body past the point where most men would have quit. This was just another mission, another person who needed him not to fail. His muscles burned. His hands were scraped raw. But he kept climbing, one careful movement at a time, until finally he felt hands grabbing his coat, pulling him up and over the edge onto solid ground. He lay there for a moment, breathing hard, Lucy still clutched against his chest. Then Sarah was there, gathering her daughter into her arms, sobbing and laughing at the same time. Emma threw herself at both of them, and they became a tangle of arms and tears and relief. Jacob sat up slowly, his body protesting. He was 52 years old, and he felt every year of it right now. But they had both girls. They were alive. That was what mattered. "Thank you," Sarah said, looking at him over Lucy's head. "Thank you doesn't even begin to—" "We're not safe yet," Jacob said, though his tone was gentle. "We need to get them warm and dry. The line shack is our best option." They made their way back down to the abandoned structure, Jacob carrying Lucy now because her ankle was swollen and she couldn't walk on it. Emma stayed close to her mother, holding her hand tight, occasionally looking back at her sister as if to make sure she was still there. Inside the line shack, Jacob got a fire going in the old stone hearth. It took some doing. The wood was damp and his hands were shaking from exhaustion, but eventually flames caught and held. The warmth was immediate and blessed. Sarah stripped the wet clothes off both girls and wrapped them in Jacob's spare blankets. He gave them each a piece of the dried venison he'd brought, and Lucy ate it like she was starving, which she probably was. Emma ate more slowly, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. "You came for us," she said quietly. "Mama said no one would help." "Your mama found the right person to ask," Jacob said. "The townspeople said it was too dangerous." There was no accusation in Emma's voice, just statement of fact. "Mr. Reeves said Mama should wait until morning. He said if we'd been smart girls, we wouldn't have run off in the first place." Sarah's face hardened. "When did you hear that?" "We went to his store first, before you went to other houses. I heard him talking to you through the window." Jacob watched Sarah process this. The realization that Reeves had been the first to refuse had perhaps even influenced the others. The anger that flickered across her face was righteous and barely contained. "Why did you run?" Jacob asked Emma gently. "What scared you so much that you took your sister out into a storm?" Emma looked at Lucy, then at her mother, then down at her hands. "I heard Mr. Reeves talking to someone at the store. I'd gone to trade eggs, and they didn't know I was there," he said. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said that Mama would come around once she realized she had no choice. That without help from town, she couldn't keep the homestead, and then she'd have to marry him or lose everything. He said once he was our papa, he'd make sure we learned to mine properly." Sarah's face had gone pale. "Emma, why didn't you tell me? I was scared. He said children who tell tales get sent away to orphanages. He said it happened all the time to children of widows who couldn't behave." Tears were streaming down Emma's face now. And then, tonight, I saw him riding toward our house, and I thought he was coming to take us away. So I grabbed Lucy, and we ran. Jacob felt a cold fury settling in his chest. This wasn't just a man being persistent or inappropriate. This was calculated intimidation, manipulation, threats against children. This was the kind of cruelty that he'd thought he'd left behind when he quit the world of men and their meanness. "He's not taking you anywhere," Jacob said, and the certainty in his voice made both girls look at him. "I promise you that." Sarah met his eyes across the fire, and something passed between them, an understanding, an alliance. They were in this together now. Whatever came next. The storm had begun to ease outside, the wind dying down to a steady blow rather than a howl. Dawn would come in a few hours. They needed rest, all of them, but there would be time enough for that back at Jacob's cabin. "Can we stay with you?" Lucy asked Jacob, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. "Just for a little while. Until the bad man goes away." Jacob looked at the little girl, at her sister, at their mother. He thought about his empty cabin, his solitary life, his carefully constructed isolation. He thought about Margaret and Daniel, about the family he'd lost, and the hole they'd left behind. "Yes," he said, "you can stay with me as long as you need to." They rested until dawn, taking turns keeping watch and tending the fire. Jacob found himself watching Sarah as she slept, curled protectively around both her daughters. There was something about the way she held them fierce and gentle at the same time that reminded him painfully of Margaret. When the first grey light filtered through the cracks in the line shack's walls, Jacob knew they needed to move. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but treacherous with mud and standing water. Lucy couldn't walk on her injured ankle, so Jacob carried her. Emma stayed close to her mother, still quiet and watchful. They made their way back down the mountain, moving slowly but steadily. As they descended, they had to pass near Dead Man's Ridge. Jacob had been trying not to think about it, but there it was, the place where everything had ended 8 years ago, the place he'd avoided ever since. Sarah noticed when his steps slowed, when his breathing changed. "What is it?" Jacob stopped, looking up at the ridge. In the morning light, it seemed almost peaceful, just rock and pine and sky. But he could still see it the way it had been that day. Rain-swollen creek turned to raging flood, the broken bodies at the base of the cliff. "This is where they died," he said quietly. "My wife and son, right here." Sarah's hand found his arm, a gentle pressure. Emma and Lucy had gone quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. "Margaret wanted to visit her sister in the valley," Jacob continued, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I was supposed to go with them, but I got a scouting job, good money. We needed it. Told her I'd catch up in a few days. She took Daniel and started out alone." He paused, his throat tight. Storm came up sudden like the one last night. Creek flooded, their wagon got caught trying to cross. Margaret got Daniel out, tried to save him, but he couldn't finish. Sarah didn't say anything, just kept her hand on his arm, letting him find his own way through it. I found them 3 days later. Daniel was still holding his mother's hand. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out the pocket watch he always carried. This was his. Margaret gave it to him for his 6th birthday, just a week before. It stopped the moment he died. The watch face showed 3:47, frozen in time forever. "I blamed myself," Jacob continued. "Still do, most days. If I'd been there, if I'd turned down that job, if I'd insisted we wait for better weather, so many ifs. After we buried them, I couldn't stand being around people. Couldn't stand their sympathy, their prayers, their promises that time would heal. So I built my cabin, and I stayed away from everyone." "But you couldn't stay away last night," Sarah said softly. Jacob looked at her, then at her daughters. "No, I couldn't." "Do you know what I think?" Sarah asked. I think Margaret and Daniel would be glad you came. I think they'd be proud of you." Jacob felt something break open inside him, something that had been locked tight for 8 years. "I couldn't save them. But maybe you saved us," Emma said suddenly, speaking for the first time that morning. "You saved me and Lucy, and our mama." The simple truth of it hit Jacob like a blow. He had saved them. Not Margaret and Daniel, he would carry that failure forever, but he had saved this family. Maybe that was what he'd needed all along. Not to forget his loss, but to honor it by protecting others. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice rough with emotion. But something had shifted in him. Some weight he'd been carrying had gotten just a little bit lighter. They walked on, and Jacob found himself talking more, telling Sarah about his life with Margaret, about Daniel's curiosity and laughter, about the good years before the tragedy. Sarah listened, occasionally sharing her own memories of Thomas, of the life they'd built together before his death. "We're quite a pair," Sarah said at one point, almost smiling. "Two widowed people trying to make sense of a world that took too much from us." "Maybe that's why we understand each other," Jacob said. They reached his cabin by mid-morning. Jacob had never been so glad to see it solid, safe, his refuge. But as they approached, he realized it would never be quite the same. He'd brought the world back with him, in the form of a woman and 2 children who needed him. Inside, he got the fire roaring and set water to boil for coffee and washing. Sarah helped the girls clean up and change into some of Jacob's old shirts that could serve as makeshift nightgowns. Lucy's ankle needed proper wrapping, and Jacob did it with careful, practiced hands. "You're good at this," Sarah observed, watching him work. "Army taught me field medicine. You learn to make do with what you have." With the girls settled and warming by the fire, Sarah helped Jacob tend to his own injuries, his scraped hands, a gash on his arm he hadn't even noticed getting. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared hardship. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. "Reeves won't just give up. He has money, influence. Half the town owes him something." "Then we need to be smarter than him," Jacob said. "And we need proof of what he's done." Emma, who had been listening, reached into the pocket of her wet dress, which Sarah had hung to dry. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, soaked but still readable. "I took this from his store," she said, holding it out to Jacob. "The day I heard him talking. I don't know if it helps," but Jacob unfolded the paper carefully. It was a legal document, dated 3 days ago. A petition for custody of Emma and Lucy Bennett, filed by Clayton Reeves, claiming Sarah was an unfit mother and that he, as a respected member of the community, should be granted guardianship. Sarah had never been served these papers. The hearing was scheduled for 6 days from now. Reeves had planned to have it all sewn up before Sarah even knew what was happening. "This changes everything," Jacob said, his mind already working through the implications. "This is proof of his intentions. But we need more. We need to show the pattern, the threats, the manipulation." He looked at Sarah, at her daughters, at the family that had unexpectedly become his responsibility. "We're going to fight him," he said, "and we're going to win." Over the next 2 days, Jacob's cabin became something it had never been, a home filled with life. The girls adapted quickly to their temporary sanctuary. Lucy, once her ankle started healing, became fearless in her exploration of the cabin and surrounding woods, always under Jacob's watchful eye. Emma remained more cautious, but Jacob noticed her beginning to relax, to smile occasionally, to ask questions about his carvings and his life. Sarah proved herself both capable and resilient. She took over the cooking without being asked, organized the cabin with quiet efficiency, and began teaching the girls their lessons in the afternoons. Jacob found himself looking forward to these moments, the sound of young voices reciting their letters, Sarah's patient corrections, the domestic peace he'd thought lost forever. But beneath the surface calm, they were all aware that this was temporary. Reeves was still out there, still a threat. The custody hearing was only 4 days away now. On the 3rd morning, Jacob made a decision. I'm riding into town. We need to know what we're dealing with." Sarah looked up from the bread she was kneading, concern crossing her face. "Is that wise? Reeves has friends there, which is why I need to go. We can't fight him blind." He pulled on his coat. "I'll be back before dark." The ride to Timber Falls took an hour and a half. The town was just waking up when Jacob arrived, smoke rising from chimneys, shopkeepers opening their doors. He tied Silver outside the general store, Reeves's store, and went to the saloon instead. The bartender, a man named Pete who Jacob had known for years, looked surprised to see him. "Jacob Mercer, heard you pulled off quite the rescue during that storm. News travels fast, always does, especially when it involves Clayton Reeves." Pete leaned in, lowering his voice. "He's been asking around about you. Wants to know why you're involved with Sarah Bennett." "What's he saying?" "That you're interfering in private matters. That Sarah came to you in an inappropriate manner. He's being careful with his words, but the implication is clear. He's trying to make you look bad and her look desperate." Jacob felt his anger rise, but kept his voice level. "What else?" "There's talk of a custody hearing. Reeves has been spreading it around that Sarah can't properly care for those girls, that they're running wild, that the incident during the storm proves she's neglectful." Pete shook his head. "Most folks aren't buying it, but some are. Reeves has called in a lot of favors." Jacob thanked Pete and left the saloon. He spent the next few hours moving quietly through town, talking to people he trusted. The picture that emerged was troubling. Reeves had been planning this for months, systematically isolating Sarah, cutting off her credit, discouraging others from helping her, building a case that she was failing as a mother. It was at the land office that Jacob found the most damning evidence. The clerk, a young man named Thomas Jr., named for Sarah's late husband, as it turned out, had information he'd been afraid to share. "Mr. Mercer, there's something you should know," he said, glancing nervously at the door. "Mr. Reeves filed a claim on the Bennett homestead 2 weeks ago. Said Sarah had defaulted on debts to his store, that he had the right to seize the property in lieu of payment." "Does Sarah know about this?" "No, sir." Reeves said he'd inform her personally. "But if that custody hearing goes his way and he gets guardianship of the girls, then Sarah would have no choice but to accept his marriage proposal or lose everything, her home, her children, everything." Jacob felt a cold fury settling over him. This wasn't just harassment or unwanted attention. This was a calculated plan to strip Sarah of every choice, every bit of independence, until she had no option but to submit to Reeves' demands. "Is there more?" Jacob asked quietly. Thomas Jr. hesitated, then pulled out another document from under the counter. "This came through yesterday. I shouldn't show you, but Sarah's husband was my uncle. I can't let this happen to her." Jacob took the document and read it carefully. It was a letter from the territorial magistrate, the same one scheduled to hear the custody case addressed to Reeves. The language was coded, but clear to anyone who knew how to read it. The magistrate was in Reeves' pocket. The hearing was a formality, and the custody would be granted unless something dramatic changed. "Can I take this? If it gets traced back to me, I'll lose my job. Probably worse." "It won't." Jacob folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Thank you. You've done right by your uncle's memory." Jacob was heading back to Silver when he heard a familiar voice call his name. He turned to see Reeves himself, standing in the doorway of his general store, flanked by 2 men Jacob didn't recognize. Hired muscle, by the look of them. "Mr. Mercer," Reeves said, his tone falsely pleasant. "I heard you were playing hero during the storm. Very admirable, I'm sure, just doing what any decent person would do." Of course, though I must say, I'm curious about your sudden interest in Mrs. Bennett and her children. You've been a hermit for years, and now suddenly you're involving yourself in private family matters." Jacob kept his expression neutral. "A woman asked for help finding her lost children. I helped. That's all there is to it." "Is it?" Reeves stepped closer, and his 2 men moved with him. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're interfering with legitimate legal proceedings, Missus. Bennett is facing a custody evaluation, and your presence, your influence could be seen as inappropriate. What's inappropriate? Jacob said quietly. Is a man using his money and position to manipulate a widow into marriage? What's inappropriate is filing legal papers and not serving them. What's inappropriate is threatening children. Reeves' pleasant facade cracked slightly. I don't know what lies Sarah has been telling you, but I'm not talking about what Sarah told me. I'm talking about what her daughter Emma heard you say. About how you planned to force Sarah's hand. About how you've been systematically cutting off her options. The 2 hired men moved closer, but Reeves held up a hand to stop them. Be very careful, Mercer. You're making accusations you can't prove. Can't I? Jacob patted his coat where the letter rested. We'll see about that. He started to turn away, but Reeves spoke again, his voice dropping to something colder and more threatening. You're a fool if you think you can fight me. I own half this town. The magistrate is a personal friend. Even if you had evidence which I doubt who would believe, a hermit and a desperate widow over me. Jacob turned back, and something in his eyes made both hired men take a step back. You know what I learned in my years as an army scout? I learned that bullies always make the same mistake. They think power is the same thing as strength. It's not. He walked to Silver, mounted up, and rode out of town. Behind him, he could feel Reeves' eyes on his back, could sense the threat there. But he'd gotten what he came for. Information, evidence, and a clear picture of what they were up against. When he got back to the cabin, Sarah was waiting on the porch, anxiety written across her face. What did you find out? Jacob dismounted and pulled out the documents he'd gathered: the land claim, the letter from the magistrate, the custody petition. He laid them out on the table inside, while the girls played in the loft, out of earshot. It's worse than we thought, he said. Reeves has been planning this for months. He's filed a claim on your homestead, saying you owe him money. The custody hearing is rigged, the magistrate is his friend. And if he gets guardianship of the girls, you'll have no legal standing to refuse his marriage proposal. Sarah's face had gone pale. So, he gets everything. My daughters, my home, my life. Not if we can help it. Jacob pulled out the letter from the magistrate. This is proof of corruption. But we need more time, and we need to get this to someone who can actually do something about it. Who? Everyone in Timber Falls is either afraid of Reeves or in his debt. Jacob thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. The territorial marshal in Helena. His jurisdiction supersedes local magistrates. If we can get these documents to him, prove the corruption and the threats. Helena is 3 days' ride from here. The hearing is in 4 days. Then I need to leave now, tonight. Jacob looked at her. Can you and the girls stay here safely? I'll leave you the rifle, show you how to barricade the door if needed. Sarah met his eyes, and he saw the fear there, but also trust. How long will you be gone? 6 days round trip if I push hard. I'll be back before the hearing. And if Reeves comes here, then you don't open the door for anyone but me. And if he tries to force his way in, Jacob showed her how to load and aim the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder. You protect your daughters. You do whatever you have to do. That evening, Jacob prepared for the journey. Sarah helped him pack supplies, moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency. The girls had been told he was going on a trip, but not why, and they seemed to accept it with the resilience of children who'd already survived worse. As darkness fell and Jacob prepared to mount up, Lucy ran out and handed him a small flower she'd picked. For luck, she said. Emma was more reserved, but she looked at Jacob with something like hope in her eyes. You're coming back, right? And he meant it. Jacob rode through the night, pushing Silver as hard as he dared. The trail to Helena was well known to him. He'd ridden it many times during his scouting days, but that didn't make it easier. The recent storm had left the ground treacherous, and several creek crossings that were normally simple now required careful navigation. He stopped only to rest Silver, never for more than an hour. While the mare recovered, Jacob would doze fitfully, his hand always on his rifle, his mind unable to fully rest. He kept thinking about Sarah and the girls back at his cabin, about what would happen if Reeves showed up before he returned. He'd shown Sarah how to defend herself, but would it be enough? By the second day, his body was protesting the hard ride. His back ached, his legs were stiff, and his hands were raw from gripping the reins. But he pushed on, driven by a sense of urgency that went beyond logic. He couldn't fail them, not after everything. He reached Helena late on the third day, exhausted and filthy from the road. The territorial marshal's office was in the center of town, a solid brick building that spoke of federal authority. Jacob tied Silver outside, made sure she had water, and went in. Marshal James Hawthorne was a man in his late 50s, grey-haired but still strong, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. He looked up from his desk as Jacob entered, taking in the travel-worn appearance, the urgency in Jacob's posture. "Help you? I need to report corruption and illegal custody proceedings in Timber Falls." Jacob pulled out the documents and laid them on the marshal's desk. "And I need your help to stop it." Hawthorne studied Jacob for a long moment, then began reading through the papers. His expression grew darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up at Jacob. "These are serious accusations. The magistrate in Timber Falls has been in his position for 15 years, and he's been corrupt for at least some of them." Jacob leaned forward. "Marshal, there's a woman and 2 children who are about to lose everything because one wealthy man decided he wants them and doesn't care what he has to do to get them. The hearing is in 3 days. If you don't intervene, it's going to happen." "Tell me everything," Hawthorne said. Jacob did. He started with the night Sarah came to his door and told the marshal everything: the rescue, Emma's revelations about Reeves's threats, the systematic isolation of Sarah, the unfiled legal documents, the land claim, the corrupt magistrate. He spoke clearly and precisely, using the skills he'd learned reporting to army officers, making sure every fact was presented without embellishment. When he finished, Hawthorne sat back in his chair. "I've heard whispers about Clayton Reeves before. Nothing substantial enough to act on, but this changes things." He tapped the letter from the magistrate. "This alone is enough to warrant investigation. The rest of it paints a picture of a man who thinks he's above the law. Can you stop the hearing?" "I can do better than that. I can attend it, with my authority as territorial marshal. I can review these documents publicly, in front of the whole town, and I can arrest anyone involved in this scheme: Reeves, the magistrate, whoever else." He stood. "We ride out tomorrow morning. My deputy will come with us." Relief flooded through Jacob, so intense it almost made him dizzy. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have to get there in time. And we have to make this stick. Reeves sounds like the kind of man who'll have lawyers and contingency plans." Hawthorne studied Jacob. "Why are you doing this? You're not family, not even a close friend by your own account. What's your stake in this?" Jacob thought about how to answer that. 8 years ago, I lost my wife and son. I wasn't there to save them, and I've been living with that failure ever since. Maybe I can't fix what happened to me, but I can stop it from happening to someone else." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "That's as good a reason as any. Get some sleep, Mercer. We have a hard ride ahead of us." Jacob found a room at a boarding house and collapsed onto the bed. He slept deeply for the first time in days, though his dreams were troubled. Images of Sarah and the girls, of Reeves' threatening smile, of arriving too late to help. He woke before dawn and was at the marshal's office when Hawthorne and his deputy arrived. They rode out as the sun rose, 3 men on a mission to deliver justice. Meanwhile, back at Jacob's cabin, Sarah was discovering that waiting was its own kind of torture. The first 2 days passed quietly enough. She kept the girls occupied with lessons and chores, taught them some of the foraging skills Jacob had shown her, and tried not to think about what might be happening in Helena. But on the third day, a rider appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. Sarah saw him from the window, and her heart jumped into her throat. She recognized the horse. It belonged to one of Reeves' hired men. "Girls," she said, keeping her voice calm, "go up to the loft. Now, and don't come down until I say." Emma grabbed Lucy and pulled her toward the ladder. Sarah could see the fear in Emma's eyes, but also the trust. They'd been through worse, and they'd survived. Sarah took down the rifle Jacob had left, checked that it was loaded as he'd shown her. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she forced them steady. She would not let fear control her. Not anymore. The knock came a moment later. "Mrs. Bennett, I have a message from Mr. Reeves." Sarah didn't answer. Jacob had been clear. "Don't open the door for anyone." "Mrs. Bennett, I know you're in there. Mr. Reeves asked me to deliver some papers, legal papers about the custody hearing tomorrow." Tomorrow. The hearing was tomorrow now, and Jacob wasn't back yet. Sarah felt panic trying to claw its way up her throat, but she pushed it down. "You can leave them on the porch," she called out. "They require your signature, ma'am. I need to witness it. I'm not opening the door." There was a pause. Then, "Mr. Reeves said you might be difficult. He wanted me to let you know that if you don't appear at the hearing tomorrow, the magistrate will rule in his favor by default. You'll lose custody of your daughters, and you'll lose your homestead." "Is that what you want?" Sarah closed her eyes. It was a trap, all of it. If she went to the hearing, she'd be walking into Reeves' corrupted system. If she didn't go, she'd lose by default. Either way, he won. Unless Jacob made it back with help. Unless the marshal believed him and acted. Unless 100 things went right that might not. "Tell Mr. Reeves," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt, "that I'll be at that hearing, and I'll have plenty to say." She heard the rider leave, his horse's hooves fading into the distance. When he was gone, she let the girls come down from the loft. Emma looked at her with questions in her eyes. "Is Mr. Jacob coming back?" Lucy asked. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "He promised, and he keeps his promises." That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept the rifle close, started at every sound, and watched the trail for any sign of riders. The hearing was at 10 o'clock the next morning. If Jacob wasn't back by, then she'd have to go alone and face Reeves and his corrupted magistrate with nothing but the truth and her own determination. The truth had never been enough before, but maybe this time would be different. Dawn came grey and cold. Sarah got the girls ready, dressing them in their best clothes, which weren't much, but they were clean and mended. She braided Emma's hair carefully and tied Lucy's with the ribbon Jacob had found during the search. "Are we going to town?" Emma asked. "Yes. There's something Mama has to do there. Something important." "Will Mr. Reeves be there?" "Yes." Emma's face set in determined lines. "Then we're going with you. You shouldn't face him alone." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to leave them safely at the cabin, but she knew Emma was right. This was about all of them. They should be there. They were preparing to leave when they heard it, the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Sarah's heart sank. More of Reeves' men, coming to make sure she attended the hearing, or worse, coming to take the girls before she could even try to fight. She grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the door. "Girls upstairs, now." But Emma had gone to the window. "Mama, it's Mr. Jacob, and there are 2 other men with him. They have badges." Sarah rushed to the window and saw it was true. Jacob was riding hard toward the cabin, and with him were 2 men in official gear, a marshal and a deputy by the look of them. Relief and hope flooded through her so intensely she had to lean against the wall for support. Jacob had made it back, and he'd brought help. She threw open the door and ran out to meet them. Jacob dismounted even before Silver had fully stopped, and for a moment they just looked at each other, 2 people who'd been through fire together and come out the other side. "You came back," Sarah said. "I promised." Jacob turned to the marshal. "Marshal Hawthorne, Deputy Pierce, This is Sarah Bennett and her daughters Emma and Lucy." Hawthorne tipped his hat. "Ma'am, I understand there's a custody hearing this morning. I think we should all attend. I have some questions for the magistrate and Mr. Reeves." Sarah looked at Jacob, at the marshal, at the official documents Jacob held. For the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope, that wasn't desperate or fleeting, but real and solid. "Then let's not keep them waiting," she said. Jacob moved faster than anyone would have expected from a man his age. He intercepted Reeves before the man could reach Emma, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. The force of it sent Reeves stumbling backward into the chairs. "Don't," Jacob said, his voice deadly quiet. "Don't even think about it." Reeves scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. All pretense of respectability was gone now, replaced by something raw and ugly. "You've ruined everything. You had no right. I had every right." Jacob stood between Reeves and the girls, an unmovable barrier. "You threatened children. You manipulated a widow. You corrupted the law. If you think I'm going to stand by and let that happen, you don't know me at all." Deputy Pierce moved forward to restrain Reeves, but the man wasn't done yet. "She was mine. I gave her time, gave her chances. She should have been grateful. A woman alone, with children to feed, I was offering her security, respectability. You were offering her a prison," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was shaking but strong. "You thought because I was vulnerable, because I was alone, I had no choice but to accept whatever you decided to give me. But I do have a choice. I've always had a choice. And what choice is that?" Reeves sneered. "To run to another man? To let this hermit play hero while you bat your eyes and play helpless? You're proving my point. You can't survive alone." "She's not alone," Jacob said. And she never was helpless. She crossed a flooded creek in a killer storm to find someone who would help her children. She tracked through dangerous country in the dark. She stood up to you, even when everyone else was too afraid. That's not helpless. That's stronger than you'll ever understand. Marshal Hawthorne had heard enough. "Clayton Reeves, you're under arrest for attempted fraud, corruption of legal proceedings, and making threats against minors. Deputy, take him into custody." "You can't do this," Reeves said, but the certainty was gone from his voice now. "I have friends, connections." "Not anymore." "You don't." This came from an unexpected source, Pete, from the saloon, standing near the back of the room. "I've been keeping quiet about the way you do business for too long, so have a lot of folks here. But what you tried to do to Sarah and those girls, that's a line you don't cross." Others in the crowd murmured agreement. Jacob saw the shift happen. The town that had been too afraid or too apathetic to help was finally finding its spine. Sometimes it just took one person standing up to make others realize they could do the same. As Deputy Pierce led Reeves out in handcuffs, Marshal Hawthorne turned to Magistrate Whitman. "You have a choice to make, Judge. You can resign quietly and face reduced charges, or you can fight this and face the full weight of territorial law. What's it going to be?" Whitman looked around the room at faces that had once shown him respect and now showed only disappointment and anger. "I'll resign," he said quietly. "Effective immediately." Hawthorne nodded. "Smart choice. Someone will be along to collect your official documents and seal." He turned to the crowd. "This hearing is dismissed. Mrs. Bennett retains full custody of her daughters, as she should. The land claim is invalidated, and any debts supposedly owed to Mr. Reeves are under investigation. If anyone else has documentation of business dealings with Reeves that seemed questionable, see Deputy Pierce." The tension in the room broke like a fever. People began talking all at once, some coming forward to apologize to Sarah, others discussing what they'd witnessed. Emma and Lucy stayed close to their mother, holding her hands. Jacob found himself standing slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. This was Sarah's victory, her moment of vindication. He'd helped, but she was the one who'd had the courage to fight when it would have been easier to give up. Sarah caught his eye across the room and smiled a real smile, not the careful, guarded expressions he'd seen before. She said something to the girls and then made her way through the crowd to him. "You did it," she said. "We did it." "No." She shook her head. "You rode for 3 days to get help. You brought back a marshal. You stood up to Reeves when everyone else was too afraid. You—" Her voice broke slightly. "You kept your promise. To me, to my daughters. You kept every promise you made." "That's what decent people do," Jacob said simply. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "It is, but there aren't as many decent people in the world as there should be." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Jacob, I know this isn't the time or place, but when things settle down, I'd like to talk to you. About what happens next." Jacob understood what she was asking. What happened next for her and her daughters? Yes, but also what happened next for the two of them, for whatever this thing was that had grown between them during their shared ordeal. "I'd like that too," he said. Emma and Lucy came over then, Lucy attaching herself to Jacob's leg in a hug. "You saved us again," she said. "Your mama saved you," Jacob corrected gently. "I just helped." Emma looked at him with those serious, old, beyond their years eyes. "Are you going back to your cabin now? Are we going back to ours?" Jacob glanced at Sarah, seeing the question in her eyes too. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But wherever we go, we'll figure it out together." Marshal Hawthorne approached. "Mercer, I'll need you to stay in town for a few days. More statements to give, paperwork to file. Think you can manage that?" Jacob looked at the marshal, then at Sarah and her daughters, then at the town around him, the place he'd been avoiding for 8 years. It didn't seem as terrible as he remembered. Maybe because he wasn't alone anymore. "I can manage," he said. 3 months later, spring had come to the mountains with a gentleness that felt like a promise. The snow had melted, wildflowers covered the meadows, and the world seemed fresh and full of possibility. Jacob stood on the porch of his cabin, except it wasn't just his cabin anymore. The sign above the door, hand-carved by his own careful hands, read, "The Mercer Bennett Home." It had taken him a week to get the lettering just right, and when Sarah had seen it for the first time, she'd cried. They'd married quietly a month after the hearing, with Emma and Lucy as witnesses and Marshal Hawthorne, who'd stayed to see the case through, officiating. It hadn't been a grand affair, just a simple ceremony in the cabin with a few friends from town. But it had been real, built on genuine respect and affection rather than desperation or convenience. The cabin had changed. A new addition was under construction, 2 proper bedrooms for the girls, and eventually perhaps for other children, if life blessed them that way. Sarah had organized the main room with quiet efficiency, adding touches of domesticity that Jacob had never thought to include: curtains on the windows, a proper table with 4 chairs, wildflowers in a jar. But the worn rifle still hung above the fireplace, a reminder of the past they'd both survived. Jacob's pocket watch sat on the mantel beside it, no longer stopped at 3:47. Sarah had convinced him to have it repaired, arguing that Margaret and Daniel would want him to move forward, not remain frozen in time. The watch ticked steadily now, marking moments that were building into a new life. Emma and Lucy had thrived in the security of a stable home. Lucy's ankle had healed completely, and she spent her days exploring the woods around the cabin with fearless curiosity, always bringing back treasures, interesting rocks, bird feathers, unusual flowers. Emma had started helping Jacob with his carvings, showing a natural talent for seeing the shape hidden in the wood. Sarah had transformed as well. The tension that had lined her face was gone, replaced by genuine peace. She'd started teaching not just her own daughters, but children from neighboring homesteads who came once a week for lessons. The cabin had become a gathering place, a center of community in a way Jacob had never imagined it could be. The legal aftermath had been swift. Reeves was serving 5 years in territorial prison for fraud and corruption. Magistrate Whitman had resigned and left the territory entirely. a new magistrate had been appointed, Thomas Jr. From the land office, young but honest and determined to restore integrity to the position. Sarah's homestead had been cleared of all fraudulent claims, and several other families had come forward with similar stories of Reeves' manipulation. The new marshal's investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse that went back years. Somehow, in trying to destroy one family, Reeves had ended up exposing his entire corrupt operation. Jacob heard laughter from inside the cabin and turned to see Sarah helping the girls with their afternoon lessons. Emma was reading aloud, her voice confident and clear. Lucy was drawing letters on a slate, her tongue stuck out in concentration. Sarah looked up and caught Jacob watching, and the smile she gave him was full of warmth. He stepped back inside, and Lucy immediately abandoned her letters to run to him. "Papa Jacob, look what I drew." She held up the slate, which showed a stick-figure family, 4 people holding hands. The name still surprised him sometimes. Papa Jacob. The girls had started calling him that a few weeks after the wedding, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence when he didn't object. He'd never asked them to. It had simply emerged naturally, their way of defining what he'd become to them. "That's beautiful, Lucy," he said, kneeling down to examine her drawing more carefully. "Is that all of us?" "Yes. That's Mama, that's me, that's Emma, and that's you. We're a family." "Yes," Jacob said, something tightening in his chest. "We are." That evening, after the girls were in bed, Jacob and Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Silver grazed peacefully in the meadow, and somewhere in the distance a nightbird called. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up your solitude?" Jacob thought about how to answer. There was a part of him that sometimes missed the simplicity of living alone, the lack of complications, but it was a very small part, and it was vastly outweighed by everything else: the laughter in his home, the purpose in his days, the warmth of sleeping beside someone who cared for him. "No," he said simply. "I thought I was done living when Margaret and Daniel died. Thought the best I could hope for was to exist until my time ran out. But I was wrong. This," he gestured at the cabin, at the life they'd built. "This is living, and I'm grateful for every day of it." Sarah leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then she said, "Emma asked me today if you were her real father now. What did you tell her?" "I told her that real isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you when it's hard. By that measure, you're as real a father as anyone could be." Jacob felt his throat tighten. He'd never expected to be a father again, had thought that chance was buried with Daniel. But here he was, raising 2 girls who weren't his by birth, but who'd chosen him as surely as he'd chosen them. "I never thought I'd get a second chance," he said. "At family, at happiness, at any of it. I thought that storm took everything worth having." "Sometimes storms don't just destroy," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes they clear away what's broken and make room for something new to grow." Jacob thought about the night Sarah had appeared at his door, desperate and drenched, and asking for help. He thought about the choice he'd made to open that door, to step back into the world, to risk caring again. It had been the hardest thing he'd done in years, and the best. Inside the cabin, one of the girls called out in her sleep, just a murmur, nothing distressed. Sarah started to rise, but Jacob put a hand on her arm. "I'll check on them." He went inside and climbed to the loft where the girls slept. Emma was curled on her side, one arm around Lucy, just as she'd been that night in the cave. Protecting her little sister even in sleep, Lucy was smiling at something in her dreams, peaceful and safe. Jacob adjusted their blankets and stood there for a moment, watching them breathe, his daughters, not by blood, but by choice and by love and by the bonds forged in shared hardship. Margaret would have liked them, he thought, would have approved of this second family, this second chance. He went back outside to Sarah, to the woman who'd knocked on his door and changed everything. The woman who'd had the courage to ask for help and the strength to fight for her children. The woman who'd somehow seen past his isolation to the man he could still be. "They're fine," he said, sitting beside her again, both sleeping soundly. "Good." Sarah took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Jacob, I want you to know I didn't just marry you because I needed help or security. I married you because you're a good man, because you make me laugh, because when I look at you, I see someone I want to spend my life with." "I know," Jacob said. And he did. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on respect and shared experience rather than desperation. It was solid in a way his first marriage had been solid, two people who'd chosen each other with clear eyes and full hearts. They sat together as darkness fell completely and stars emerged overhead. Inside the cabin, their daughters slept safely. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and strong. And Jacob Mercer, who'd thought his life was over at 52, discovered that some endings were really just beginnings, wearing a different face. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but what it had brought, love, family, purpose, hope, remained. And would remain, Jacob thought, for all the days he had left. Some storms, he'd learned, don't just change everything. They save it.